Hey all, we're back to pandemic mode. Woohoo! No, not really, but sort of. So I just wasn't able to cover all the stuff in class that I wanted to cover and that I want to cover. In a way, that's me. I have to tweak things a little bit so that I can cover what I want to cover in class and not try to do too much. But for this chapter, I tried to do too much. So what I am doing here is creating this online lecture to tell you the rest of what I wanted to tell you about Chapter 2. And yeah, again, in the future, I hope to not have to do this sort of cleanup, but here's the cleanup. So just going to walk you through these last set of slides. You'll hear, I was kind of looking forward to this musical cue, but I guess it won't happen in class. Stats boy's a liar, sedant dash. I think that this is funny. It uses a bunch of terms from statistics in a sort of a funny way. And it's also funny because it looks like a little video that, a little group of friends created, and I thought they might get a hit having 2,000 people kind of looking at their video and commenting or whatever. So hey, feel free to do a shout out to Sedan Dash and freak them out. Okay, so now we're gonna get into the part here that some psychology students hate. You'll notice in your psych degree that you have to take a stats class, either Psych B07 or some equivalent thereof. And a lot of people say, why do I have to take stats? I came to psychology because I hate math and I hate numbers and whatever. Okay, anytime you're in the sciences, you need to understand stats, and that's because it's directly connected to the scientific method. So these things we've been talking about, correlations, experiments, etc. The process we're kind of talking about is you start with a question, and then either through a correlational analysis or an experimental analysis, you gather some data that should relate to that question, but now you want the answer. And so to get to the answer, you have to somehow start with that data, and well, you have to use statistics. Statistics is that branch of mathematics that allows us to see if associations occur in the context of correlations, or if differences occur in the context of experiments. And so that's what we're going to talk through a little bit here. Now, I want to be very clear at the beginning. I'm not going to ask you to do any statistics in this course. You're not going to have to do math. I may want you to understand, to the extent I'm explaining what certain statistics are and how they might be different from one another. I would like you to understand that and be able to show that understanding. But you don't need a calculator. You're not going to be asked to do math. Okay, but I want you to kind of get it, to get what it's all about. So let's jump in. Not as boring as it sounds. So this is my first recommendation for statistics. People go into statistics chapters or courses or whatever thinking math, and they think, oh, I hate math. Stats isn't really about math. It uses math. There's math involved, but even the math involved is usually addition, subtraction, multiplication. We square things now and then, and we take square roots. That's pretty much it. Algebra, some simple algebra. The level of math you need to do stats well is not that high, and it's very useful. And the easiest way to get your head around the math is to understand what you're doing in the first place. Because once you understand what the stats test is doing, the math kind of presents itself. It just kind of makes sense. Okay, so rather than memorizing formulas and memorizing stuff, if you actually just kind of think about what you're doing and what the goal is, then statistics can make a whole lot more sense. So first of all, it's also all around us. This is the other, some people say, why do I have to know stats? Because you're going to be bombarded by stats all the time. We, in COVID, we kept seeing numbers, and always the news and whatever is throwing data at you. And if you don't understand, what that data actually is and what the implications of that data are, then you're in an impoverished position. Let me give you an example just to think about. This is a true statistic. It's a correlation, in fact. The more cheeseburgers one eats, the less likely they are to die of cancer. Negative correlation. More cheeseburgers, less likely to die of cancer. If you see that on the news, to people who haven't gone through stats and don't understand correlations and such, the implication seems to be that cheeseburgers help you, prevent you from dying from cancer. Once you understand stats a little bit more, you see something like that and you go, hey, wait a minute, what's going on there? And maybe if you think about it a little bit, you think, okay, you got to die of something. So maybe if cheeseburgers are making us die less of cancer, maybe it's because they're killing us with something else before cancer can get to us. And that's the true story. Cheeseburgers cause heart conditions and all sorts of other issues that often make people die before cancer can get them. So it's true. The more cheeseburgers you eat, the less likely you are to die of cancer. But the more cheeseburgers you eat, the sooner you are to die. Okay, and so again, when you get a little savvy with this thing, you can start to see when people are manipulating you, when they're using numbers to try to get you to believe something that the numbers don't really show. And that's one of the reasons we want you all to spend some time living in the stats world, and to get those abilities to understand what's going on. So very simply speaking, stats is the process of taking data, taking numbers, looking at them in certain ways, applying certain analyses to that, and then ultimately getting a picture of your data, getting a good sense of what it is you're actually seeing. What does this data actually tell us? Okay, so again, if we think of it in the question answer thing, it's like we started with the question, we used the question to say design the experiment, we then ran the experiment and got the data. Now we have to use the data to draw a conclusion. Okay, that's the sort of final step of the scientific process, and that's where we need stats. Okay, now there's different kinds of stats, and we call these descriptive stats and inferential stats. Descriptive are largely, as the name implies, they are meant to be descriptive. So let's do this. You're going to see my messy desktop now. Sorry about my messy desktop. But I'm going to log into squarecap.com. Actually, I think I am logged in somewhere already. I am here. Maybe I can just replenish that. Yeah, I was going to ask this question again. I don't know where I am. Let me get back to here. Go back there. Okay, so let's start this one. Start lecture 3 now. Okay, as we get this. And so once again, that question of what grade do you expect to earn in this class? Now, we don't have this to see right now, so I'm just starting this up right now. I'll maybe come back to this in a moment, but I think we asked that question here, right? Can we go into here? So let me reset. And let me do the same here. Oh, how come I can't reset? Oh. Having fun running around and you guys all get to watch. How come I can't reset this one? I can duplicate, I can delete. What if I want to look at it? I'm going to reset that one. Oh, Chapter 2, Lecture 2. What? Sure. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to start this one again. Oh, okay. All right, good. I got here somehow. I don't know how I got. Oh, I got here, but of course now it doesn't have the show distribution here, so I can't actually see the grades that are here. Do you remember when I did? I showed it to you, and it was just a mess of numbers. It was just a bunch of numbers, and when we looked at it, we couldn't. There's nothing that came from those numbers that helped us, make sense of what we were seeing. So, let's go back to here. So descriptive stats are about summarizing the data. They're not about reaching conclusions yet. Inferential statistics are going to be about reaching conclusions, drawing inferences, okay? But often that's the second step of stats. The first step is just, I have all of these numbers. I've collected all of this data. I'd like to kind of look at that data, but I'd like to look at the data in a way that actually makes some sense to me. So that's where descriptive stats come in. They allow us to describe some sample data, not enough to conclude or generalize anything. That's the inferential steps, but to describe it. literally. And we tend to do things in two ways, and this will all make sense as we flash this out a little bit. Central tendency and measurements of spread. I sometimes describe this in the following example just to help people kind of get an example. Let's say you have a single friend, and you being a good friend, I don't know if this is true or not, but you're always trying to find somebody that they might be happy with. You're always trying to matchmake, right? And so let's say you met somebody and you think, oh, that's somebody my friend would really like. I think they'd be good for them. And so you go to your friend and you say, I met somebody last night that you really got to meet. I think you two would hit it off. One of the first things that person might say, well, tell me a little bit about them. And so what you might do first off, if you're just being physical about this, you might give some sense of height and weight. Quite often we do in places where we're talking about ourselves or trying to describe ourselves, we might start at that point. 6 foot 395 pounds. That's me. That's sort of what we do with stats, except we get a sense of the middle of a distribution and how wide it is. And once you know the mean and the variance, it's kind of like when you know the height and weight of somebody, you have a sense of what they look like. Even though you don't have any of the details, you do have that first rough sense. And that's the same kind of thing we do with stats. So we'll often do measures of central tendency and measures of spread. And we'll show you some examples of that as we go through. And so that we can get a distribution that allows us to see the data. But when we ultimately want to answer the question of the study, that's where we use inferential statistics. So inferential statistics isn't just about looking at data, it's about asking specific questions like, is this variable related to that variable? Or in that experiment, is this group behaving the same as that group? And so now we actually want to ask questions about the data to allow us to ultimately learn something that we can generalize to the population of interest. Okay, and this is where things like correlations, and so we've talked about correlations generally, but there is a statistical test to see if a correlation is what we're going to call reliable. And there are other tests that are more in the experimental domain. We'll talk about t-tests here as a simple example of that. So I'm going to give you examples of both of these things. And just sort of the context to make sure you have the overall context in mind to kind of grab all of this. We start with some population that we're interested in. We then want to do our experiment, so we select a sample. Preferably, hopefully, we do that as randomly as we can from the population. Although you know now about things like samples of convenience, where we draw a sample because it's easy for us, like our intro psych students, etc. All these issues with respect to sampling. But anyway, we end up with a sample of people, a subset of the population. And then we do something with those people. Like if it's a correlation, we may ask them a couple of questions, measure two variables and see if those variables are related, etc. And we can now, once we get this data, we can use descriptive statistics to kind of look at the data. In the case of a correlation, you're going to see scatter plots. You're going to understand how scatter plots kind of are a picture of the relationship. And so that's great to just look at your data, understand your data from the sample, but when you then want to use that data to make inferences about the population, this is where inferential statistics are going to come in. And quite often we do it in these sort of two steps. The first step, when you got a set of data, if I have a student working with me and they've collected a bunch of data, the first thing I do is say, hey, create some histograms, create some scatter plots, let's look at the data and let's just see what it looks like first. And now let's run some other statistics to answer those questions we're interested in. Okay, all right. So let's jump in and let's begin with this descriptive statistics. I kind of talked about it in a human being. We talk about height versus weight. Well, in a distribution. So first of all, what's a distribution? You're going to see things like this. And what I would suggest is you maybe check out online the thing called frequency histogram. Frequency histograms, I think we should talk about this a little bit. So let's say we just measured, for example, the height of students in our class. And let me just grab a frequency histogram of height. I don't know. And you'll see something like this. So let me go to images and we'll just grab an image. Yeah, and this is a typical kind of, any one of these, the height of rays. I don't know what those are. What the frequency distribution of heights of a sample of people. Okay, there we go. So we have a frequency histogram of heights of a sample of people. So first of all, what is this thing? Well, notice that each bar is a band of height differences. Now, why some bars are fat and some bars are skinny here, I don't understand that. Usually the bars are all the same. So let's go to something that's more normal like this. Absolute frequencies of height. Okay, so this must be inches now. And so you can imagine how many people are between 65 and 66 inches, and how many people are between 66 and 67 inches, and how many people are between, and so this is literally a count. So there's 4 people here, 3 here, 4 here, 14 in that group, 12 in that group. So it's literally breaking the class into these, bands of height in this case, and then measuring how many people are within each of those bands. And what you often see, and let's even flip to this one here, what you often see are what we call normal distributions, this bell-shaped or Gaussian distribution they go by, but this bell-shaped where you get a lot in the middle, not much on the side. So let's jump back here. This is sort of on average. This would say that there's not that many people that are short, and there's not that many people that are tall, but there's a whole whack of people that are average. And that's the usual pattern in just about anything you measure. Almost anything you can measure. When you look at it, you find that whatever the average is of that measure, there's a whole lot of people who have that average size. And then there's some small and some that are large. And you get this typical bell-shaped function, or Gaussian or normal distribution. That's what we call it. Why distribution? It's how people distribute across the heights. Okay. Now notice already, by the way, that this is a good presentation of data, right? When I asked what grade you expected to receive in the course, this is what I was hoping to see. A histogram like this, and I expect that some of you think you're going to get great marks, some of you think you're going to do horrible, most of you probably think you're going to do somewhere in the 70 to 80 range, something like that. Again, this is what you see. So if we flip back to here now, that's what this is sort of representing now. This is a general form of that bell-shaped distribution that we see for everything. And when you get one of those, so first of all, you can just show that histogram. And that's probably what I'll do for you, by the way. After the M-tuner, I'll probably show you a histogram of grades, and you'll get to see exactly how many people scored what score. Okay, so histograms themselves are a way of visually presenting data that's quite useful. But sometimes we don't want to show a histogram of everything. Yeah, like when we're publishing things in a journal, we want to use our pictures for the most important data that we want to present. And, let's say you measured, 15 variables, demographic variables, how much income people make, how tall they are, how much they weigh, how old they are, all these kinds of things. In a paper, you're not going to show a histogram of every one of those things, right? It's just takes up too much space, and people don't care that much. They want to know about your sample, but they don't need to know in detail. And so what we'll sometimes do is take that histogram and boil it down to 2 numbers. One number that represents the middle of the histogram, and the most common one is, of course, the mean, but we'll talk about this in a moment, and another measure that tells us how wide that distribution is, how spread it is. So, to give you an example, let's say I asked you what marks you think you'd get, and let's say that the average was 85, but we could imagine an 85, let's pick 75 just to give us more room to move. So let's say the average was 75, but we can imagine 2 versions of that, 75 with a standard deviation of 5, or 75 with a standard deviation of 15. Okay, what's the difference there? Well, the notion is in the first one, it's 75, But when the standard deviation is kind of small, like 5, that means most people expect to be between 70 and 80. There's a whole bunch of people who think they're going to be right around that 75. That we don't spread out too far from that. But in the one where the standard deviation is 15, now there's more spread. And so that means there's more people who think they're going to get, say, 60 or less, but some people who think they're going to get 90 or more. And so it's literally saying how spread apart is that distribution. And if you can grab those two numbers, the mean and standard deviation, you can put those in a paper and just say, yeah, from our sample, often we would have a table that would just show height, weight, all the things we measured, and show their mean and standard deviation. And that tells the reader about our data, and it allows them to kind of think about it really quickly and easily. Okay. Now, first of all, why do we have 3 here? 3 measures of central tendency. They all do what they do in little different ways. Okay. So first of all, the mean. The mean is a weird thing in a way. It is the score that is simultaneously as close as it can be to all of the other scores in your sample. That's actually what it is. So it's like you have all the data points, and it's like if you could pick a data point that tried to be as close as it could to all those ones you have, where would that data point sit? And that's what we call the mean. Now, you know how to compute it. You just add up all the data points and you divide by the number of data points, right? But what it actually is, it's supposed to be representing your typical score in your data. And it's what we use a lot. And we use it a lot because it has some other statistically nice properties we like. But it has one property we don't like. It's not resistant to outliers. So what that means is if you look at something like salary, I told you that that so many variables are normally distributed. But if you look at something like salary, look at this, or even this. Let's do with this one, monthly salary. This isn't normally distributed. What we're seeing is a sort of normal down here, where people are maybe somewhere around 950, but then look at this tail of rich people, right? We often see this when it comes to salary. Here's another distribution of household income, and you see this kind of stretching out here, right? And so when you add some people that are making millions of dollars into the average salary calculation, you could get an average that's somewhere around here. That doesn't really represent your sample at all. Very few people were around there, only 157 were there, a whole bunch here, but because that mean is trying to stay close to these extreme values, it gets pulled towards the extremes. And then you can end up suggesting that the average salary is something like $225,000, which all of these people think is a ridiculous number. And, and these people are much richer. And so that mean suddenly isn't very accurate at communicating your data if there are extreme scores, okay, or what we call outliers. And in those cases, what we will often use instead is the median. The median is the point in a distribution like this where you have an even number of scores, people below and above. So if we added up all of these numbers, this is the number of people in each bar that they have. If we added them all up, we figured out what that total was, and we divided it by 2, and then we found, okay, where is the point where half of the people are below and half of the people are above? That's the median. Okay, and the median is not sensitive to outliers because it doesn't care how far above you are. It's just how many people are above and how many people are below. Okay, and that's what a median does. So sometimes we prefer the median because it is not pulled by outliers. Okay, now the mode is just the score that occurs most frequently in the distribution. We don't usually use modes a whole lot other than to just sort of look at it, but that is the most common score. So sometimes, that's interesting as well, but it's usually mean or median. Now, what about over here? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways of kind of computing spread. Really, the standard deviation and the variance are really the same thing. It's just the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. So mathematically, these are just derivatives of one another, and they just I'm not going to we're not going to worry about the math. Okay, we're not going to worry about the math. Suffice it to say, they just kind of gauge how, on average, how far a point falls from the mean. Remember I said like a standard deviation of 5 or 15. So 5 would say most of the points are within about 5 of the mean. 15 would say most of the points are within 15 of the mean. Okay, so standard deviation and variance are giving us that sense. There are other things, range, which is just from the lowest score to the highest score. That gives you a sense of spread. And interquartile range, which is from the point where 25% of the scores lie below up to where 75% lie above. And that's sort of saying this is where the middle 50% of the data live. Okay, so these are just different ways of kind of coming at the same thing, but really in this case we almost always rely on standard deviation or variance. Again, they're the same thing. And so we'll often in our studies talk about the mean of some distribution and the spread, standard deviation or variance. Okay, right. So so you might now run a study where you have two different groups, a control group and an experimental group, group A and a group B. And so one of the things you might want to know is, hey, what is the mean and standard deviation within each of those two groups? Okay. Now what you see in this example should start to intrigue you. These means look different and these standard deviations look different too. It's like very different things are happening to these two groups, which suddenly make you want to know, how are the groups different, right? Because whatever that difference is, it's producing an impact on the mean and the standard deviation. Okay, but often again, this is just how we will present it. Yeah, so casually speaking, what we mean by that is not doing any sort of test. What does the standard deviation difference imply here? Well, it says two things. It says people in group B are doing better, assuming a higher mean is good. So they're doing better, but they're also doing more similarly than one another. So whatever's going on in group B isn't just improving the score, but it's especially sort of improving it for those that were low, bringing them up a lot to where the others were, and not improving so much for those that were high. So it's kind of squishing the distribution in as we get to those higher scores. Okay. So you can start to think about these things almost visually as you're looking at the numbers, which is a great way to kind of start problem solving. Okay. And so this is an example of those scores. And so you see that group A's scores are more scattered. That's the standard deviation. Okay, just to try to give you a sense. You could try to grab that in this sort of depiction of, as we go from the blue to the red to the green, we're seeing larger and larger standard deviations. And that's just how it would look in histogram form. Okay, and we sometimes do call that more dispersion of the data. Score cap. What are we doing in score cap? Are we running this thing now? We already did that. Hey, hang on. I'm in a different one now. And goodness knows what I'm doing to these things right now. I want to do 3. I want to start 3. But that's not 3. That was 2. Where's my third lecture one? This is my third lecture one. Reset. Start. And there's the expect to earn, and then we're here. Okay, so is this where we are? We're getting into inferential. Okay, hypothesis testing. Okay, so far we've just been describing the data. But this is a kind of a fun one I like to do, and I wish we could have done this live in class, but maybe I'll take a look. So we want to get into inferential statistics, and I need you to be able to think about probabilities in the right way to do this. By the way, I just realized somebody's going to come to see me in a moment. I'm going to have to keep an eye out so I can do a quick run. I may pause and come back. But anyway, here's the idea. So I like to do this, and of course it's not true, but I come into class and I say, hey, I'm sorry to tell you that I was murdered last night. The evidence suggests that sometime between 8 and 9 p.m., someone who's about 5'6" and 5'9" with dark medium-length hair was seen running from my office. He had been he, meaning Professor Jordan, had been struck on the head with something hard and sharp-edged, like a laptop computer. An empty Presto card was found on the scene, suggesting the perpetrator is a regular Go rider. Did you do it? Okay, and so what I want you to think is I just created some random set of facts here, right? But this could be something that happened. And now we can actually ask for each one of you, how much of this evidence would imply that you might have done it, right? And so if I ask these questions, do you have an alibi between 8 and 9? Is there somebody who can say, no, that person was here with me? If you don't, that counts as 1. You have no alibi. Are you between those heights? If you are, that counts as 2. That's another evidence point against you. Do you have dark, medium length hair? If you do, there's another one. Do you have a laptop? You probably do. Are you a regular Go rider? Some of you certainly are. So for some of you, you could have upwards of 5 of these, right? Now, did you do it? Well, you didn't do it. But the point is, the more of these evidence points you have, the harder it is to reject the idea that you did it, right? The more evidence, the more it feels like you might have done it. And so we can kind of ask, what's the probability of somebody having this much evidence against them if they didn't do it, right? And we know none of you did do it, but those of you who score 5, there's a lot of evidence suggesting you might have done it. Right? And if there's a lot of evidence, then we start to reject the notion that you're innocent. This is how courts work, right? They charge somebody, but we say, oh, you're innocent till proven guilty. But now let's look at how much evidence there is. And as the evidence piles up, the probability of you being innocent goes lower and lower. And if that probability falls below some level, we say, you know what, I just don't believe you anymore. I think you did it. That is hypothesis testing. That's what we do in research. So if we flip to here now, a hypothesis is a precise, testable statement of what researchers predict will happen. An educated guess, a theory-driven guess. The textbook talks about concepts, using a concept, a conceptual notion to drive a theory, a hypothesis rather. But you want to know if it's true, and you want to test it. So you collect data, you analyze the data, and then you infer what the data means. This is where we're doing the hypothesis testing. Okay, so what do we mean by inferential statistics? Well, we want to compare experimental groups, to compare the different groups that we ran, especially in an experiment, and then make generalizations about the population. So there's the two things we've talked about. Correlation. So here's an example. Imagine we had 50 students that we recruited to look at the relationship between study duration and grades. If you study more, do you get better grades? And so our hypothesis, what is the relationship between test scores and studying duration? Now this is a very general, this is just a research question, yeah, but it's not even really a hypothesis, right? I wouldn't say this. Usually a hypothesis would be the more you study, the better the grades you get. It would be a prediction. This isn't really a prediction. This is more like a question, like, what's going on? But we would probably expect a prediction. We would probably expect something like this. So first of all, let me stop right here and say, we talked about distributions and how you can use those to understand like the mean and standard deviation. But when you're doing correlations, this is called a scatter plot. And this is actually a descriptive stats tool. It's a way of visualizing your data. And so each one of these dots would be a participant. And remember, we measure two things about the participant. We measure how long they studied and what their grade was. And so this is somebody that studied for an hour and got a grade of 70. Okay, so every one of these is a single participant and how they did on those two scores. And so one of the things we can do is just plot them like this, and that's called a scatter plot. And then we'll often do a line of best fit, if you had to put a line across those. And this line is representing the relationship now. And you're seeing this line is going upwards like this. As one variable gets bigger, the other one gets bigger. So that's suggesting a positive correlation, right? This would be a different scatter plot that would suggest a negative correlation. As study increases, marks go down. Weird. And this would be a lack of a correlation. Okay, there's not really any consistent relation between those two. So notice how just looking at these can tell you something about your data. But there's, what the data looks like, and then there's what's mathematically accurate about it. And that's where the stats come in. So often, and we're not going to go into all the detailed inferential statistics, but basically what we do with our mathematics test is we're asking, is this line flat? Does it look like this one, which is pretty flat? And so we're saying, let's take the slope of that line, which we can mathematically compute, and compare it to a zero, a flat. Is it different from zero? And the math says, well, here's the probability that it's different from zero, just like the evidence, right? And if that probability is small enough, less than 0.05, that's the decisional cutoff we use, then we say, you know what? That's so low, I can't believe it's zero. It's not zero. It's different from zero. And that's what tells us we have a reliable correlation. Okay, let's do the same thing with t-tests, and then I can maybe hit that point again. It's usually impossible to collect data from an entire population, so we have samples, right? So imagine now we're in the experimental domain, and we're going to create two groups, an experimental and a control group. And so in this case, say we're studying the impact of sleep on grades. And we allow group A to get 4 hours of sleep. Only 4 hours. That's all you get. We allow group B 8 hours of sleep. And now we want to know how they do on the exam. Is there a significant difference between group A and group B? Again, that's the research question, but if it was worded as a hypothesis, we would probably be saying something more like, we expect group B to perform better because they've had more sleep. That would be our prediction. Okay. We randomly assign people into the 4 hour, the 8 hour conditions. We put them through that 4 hour, 8 hour stuff, and then we collect data, right? So let's just, we've talked about some of these, but were Group A's test scores better than Group B's? That's what we're really going to test. Like, did the difference in sleep matter? Just to mention these variable names, because you'll come across them over and over again. The independent variable is the variable you manipulated, so that's how much sleep somebody got. The dependent variable is the variable you measured. That's how well they did on the exam. And a confound is if you allowed some other variable to sneak in that might explain the results. Is there a potential confound in this study that I just described to you? I'm going to suggest there is, but I'm going to let you think about it. What else could be going on other than one group got 4 hours sleep and one group got 8 hours sleep? Yeah, can you think of any confounds? Dum. What is that? What's with my arguing? Okay, hey, okay, we'll PowerPoint access to the camera. Wow. Okay. Weird. I don't know what that was about. And so, let's suggest, what if you did this study, and what if you found the 4 hour group did better than the 8 hour group? You'd be like, what? I thought they had 4 hours more of sleep. Why didn't that help? Well, here's a question for you. What did the 4 hour group do while the 8 hour group was sleeping? There were 4 hours when the 8 hour group was sleeping and the 4 hour group was not. Did they maybe study? And if they studied, could that produce a better mark for them because they use those 4 hours to study? Okay, that would be a confound. That would be a potential, and so you might actually find the reverse result because really you thought you were manipulating sleep duration, and you were, but something else was changing with it. That's what a confound is. Okay, so again, we're not going to get into the math. You'll get that into BO7. But what I want you to understand is we can now compare those two groups and we can say, are they different or not? And then based on that, we can say, okay, I think, sleeping more helps you or not. We can make these general claims afterwards. And that's what we use inferential statistics to do. Okay, so that was just a taste for you of descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. One thing I hope you get from this, is that it's not really all that scary. And when you go in there figuring out, I'm just trying to see if this is different than that, the tests do make sense. And a lot of people come into stats courses scared and leave thinking, wow, I can do this. This is not so tough. And that's what I think will be your experience too. So don't dread those stats courses. Realize they have an important role. They help us understand what our data means. Okay. I will leave it there. Yep. Say goodbye for now.